came from Ireland, Italy, Syria, Turkey. They spoke Hungarian, French, Polish, and more. But they were united by years of verbal, sexual, and physical abuse at the hands of factory supervisors. They were united by intolerable poverty wages. So under the banner of the International Workers of the World, and at the sneer of the American Federation of Labour, the workers of the Lawrence textile mill marched in step. And in the valiance of their solidarity was alleged to have inspired a song. W.W Roses, in its most famous incarnation, is sung by Judy Collins with music by Mimi Farinha. And it's a strangely haunting piece of music for a folk song with such an inspiring message behind it. Its aspiring call for improvement to the quality of working women's lives makes it just as likely to be heard on a picket line as Which Side Are You On or 9 to 5. But for a variety of reasons stemming from its musical quality, the calls to action within the song force it to take on a softer quality, closer to longing for this aspirational future rather than necessarily demanding it outright. And as we'll see, there may be a few reasons for this song's more passive positioning. The epizeuxis, used in lieu of a chorus and to bookend each verse here and here, highlights the core of the song's messaging. Drawing attention to the song's slow pace, the doubled repetition inbuilds a call and response style to the lyrics, requiring a collective participation to fulfill the effect. This call and response can be seen in the epizeuxis' first use in the first line of each stanza. By repeating marching, the present tense is accentuated with the second word pitched slightly higher. See, the first marching stretched over the fall from an F to a D as the initial call, and then leaping up to the second marching, which stretches over the fall and resolution from G to F. We'll talk more about the exact musical journey of the pseudo-chorus, but it's important to mention here, the repetition of W.W Roses is used to the effect of a chorus in the song. Both examples of epizeuxis contain short melismas, lasting a few notes but lengthening the words. For instance, the second, W.W Roses, ends on a minim at the resolution of D, holding for 2 beats as opposed to other lyrics which mostly fall on crotchets and therefore only hold for 1 beat. Or in the case of the final Roses, in the first exemplary stanza, which ends on a semi-breve at the resolution of B, holding for 4 beats. By combining these melodic and prosodic devices, an overall effect of emphasis is created and placed upon the activity of the verb, marching, which is essential for any union hymn calling for action. You want to emphasize what action it is you are taking. As well as this, the emphasis also falls upon the individual words and terms that make up the song's slogan. What said symbols mean is simultaneously very obvious if you're familiar with how the individual red and roses have been used historically, but also really fucking vague. They're both incredibly loaded symbols that have been tossed around the political spectrum and used for a variety of causes to invoke political messaging, ranging from royal civil wars and theocratic feudalism to social democracy and anti-fascism. To avoid complications, we're going to use a genius lyrics level base assignment of meaning. Bread symbolizing the sustenance of living, and roses being everything that comes after that. Basically, the rest of Maslow's hierarchy of needs is encapsulated in one extremely historically loaded flower. Because the phrase and messaging it carries is so simple, the lyrics which precede the pseudo-chorus can afford a greater load-bearing to contextualize the phrase within the ideology of the song. These lyrics also then need to be made easier to remember once their content becomes more complicated, which is accomplished through the music's low tempo and the song's form. The song's form is strophic, common to folk songs and chants. Because the melodic structure is repeated, it becomes easy to remember, so most mental activity can be assigned to learning the words. And also because the lyrics tend to be alliterative, and the lines contain enough rhymes between and internal to one another, these are also methods of making it more memorable. The strophic form is then compounded by the time signature used, i.e. that of 4/4 or common time, mostly seen as 4 crotchets to a bar wherein each crotchet holds for 1 beat. This signature is referred to as common due to its frequency in appearing in especially Western music, for example Irish reels and North American pop music. 2 bars of 4/4 is also theorized to be the approximate length of a human breath, try it yourself, and therefore it's the perfect signature to be marched to. The 4 crotchets to a bar structure is however frequently deviated from, where the crotchet is substituted for a minim to emphasize certain words, especially payoffs to rhymes. In the song, rhymes across lines within the same verse hold the ABCB convention, where vowel sounds match the rhyme scheme, but the number of syllables of a given word may not. In instance where it may not, we see the single beat holding crotchet subbed out for a minim or even a semi-breve to artificially lengthen the word to compensate for the drop beat and maintain the rigidity of the overall strophic form. Complementary to this, certain lines are pitched higher throughout the song, accompanying slips of the phrasing into forte to dramatize these lines. Raising the pitch has one of 2 uses, either A, to act as a bridge between the body of the verse and the pseudo-chorus, or B, to add impact to the payoff of the rhyme scheme. When acting as a bridge, the pitch elevation is used here, 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 and here, to draw attention of the preceding lines of each verse towards the chorus, and thus the conclusion of what must be demanded, or to describe the process of that demand being met, as seen through the slogan. It's a lead-in. making the fall in pitch at the chorus more impactful and urgent sounding. When acting as a payoff for the ABCB rhyme scheme, here, 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 and here, the pitch elevation cements the impact of the link between the two rhyming statements, and thus the mirrored political content of the two rhyming lines. Interesting to note that 3 of the 4 uses of this tendency also includes a presumed action. For example, while no lines are in past tense, these lines frame the action described as either having happened in some definitive past, or the event will presumably have happened by the time the phrase is sung, like in Means the Rising of the Race. This line acts as the effect to the prior line, for the rising of the women being the cause. The 2 lines together, with the chronologically latter emphasized through pitch, creates an indirect call to action which is then insisted upon musically. The song is generally sung in a higher range, at the key of B flat, a range most comfortably occupied by sopranos, most often cisgendered female singers. So the higher pitch stresses the perspective being occupied as well, that is, of a woman or women in general. Not only is this an underused perspective within politically framed folk music, especially in strike songs of the time, but also when it is used, it is usually done to highlight the spiritual fervour or strong emotion of the cause being espoused within the music. Here, the early 20th century trope of using the woman's voice as a stand-in for spiritual virtue or moral import is merged with the union hymn format. This produces a relatively unique phenomena amongst the genre, a union hymn for working women. Historically significant as it was mostly women working the grueling conditions of the textile mills, and women who mostly led the Lawrence textile strikes. Now, we've alluded to the content of those strikes a lot during this, where and how the music draws attention to the action and ideology behind striking. But after all this, why are the strikes in question called the Bread and Roses strike? To answer that, we're going to look at the brief timeline of the use of that slogan. Starting with Helen Todd, a member of the Chicago Women's Club and a trade union organizer. She was alleged to have first used the phrase during one of her women's suffrage speeches in 1910, pressing the need for industrial working women in the suffrage movement. The phrase was then alleged to have been repeated at the Chicago Garment Workers' Strike and at a campaign for Proposition 4 in California in 1911. Then, James Oppenheim, a radical poet in pseudo-socialist/broadly leftist labour circles, with him writing the poem from which the lyrics originate, which was first published in 1911 in The American and then The Public in 1912. It was in The Public that the song's inspiration was directly attributed to the Chicago Garment Workers' Strike. At the actual Lawrence, Massachusetts strike of 1912, the American Federation of Labor, which represented US-born, quote-unquote, skilled male laborers, disavowed the strike led by the IWW. The striking cohort of multilingual immigrant, quote-unquote, unskilled workers, mostly bodied and led by women, saw no support from the AFL or its suffrage affiliate in Illinois, none other than the Chicago Women's Club. There do exist historical claims of bread for all and roses too being written on signs at the strike. However, these claims are skeptically regarded as unsubstantiated with little corroboration. Following this, through 1912 to 1913, several suffragettes, including Merle Bosworth in Indiana and Rose Schneiderman in Cleveland, used this phrase in their suffragette campaigns. Each cited Todd and the Lawrence strike as inspiration interchangeably. The use culminated in Upton Sinclair's widely circulated anthology of poems, of which Oppenheim's was among them, published in 1915. This was then put to music by Carolyn Kolstad in 1917. The development of this phrase as both self-conflating and rife with misattribution nevertheless renders out the slogan consistent association with so-called first wave bourgeois feminism and labour organising, despite these causes superficially residing in similar levels of radical opposition to the then status quo of industrial American capitalism. In reality, these two causes are uncomfortable bedfellows in the big tent that could then claim to refer to itself as the competent American left. The slogan itself is used to denote the incomplete nature of industrial action, garnering for workers material benefits, but further requiring provisions of dignity, respect, and affectations of culture to make life worth living. Since the phrase was primarily used by women's suffrage activists, a movement dominated in both the US and Great Britain by socially upper and middle-class white women, the slogan adopts the class character of its proponents. In the documented speeches of the cited women, these upper-class women speak as vessels for the muse of the universal woman's experience. As representatives, rather than comrades, the speakers using the Bread and Roses phrase were positioning themselves as supplementary to the agency of working women to assert their own needs for themselves. It is important to mention that figures like Helen Todd and her colleagues in Chicago did not endorse the Lawrence strikes, despite it being led by the industrial women she sought to drive into the suffrage movement. It did not lend support due primarily to the strike being coordinated by the IWW, who the Women's Club published articles addressing, conferring that they felt the decision of the women to strike undermined the decision of the American Federation of Labour not to do so. That the IWW lacked solidarity, rather than, the other way around. I'm sure those statements had nothing to do with the fact that the IWW strike was mostly bodied by immigrants. By these upper-class women using the Bread and Roses slogan, the phrase ultimately amounts to advice to industrialists of their class on how to get women workers off the picket line and back to work. Slightly better pay, use respectful language while exploiting them, and add a few treats on the work site. All these, it is framed, can be used to coax women workers back to the factory floor. In similar notions, ultimately these suffragettes wanted to be incentivized to be placated away from aligning with working class people of any gender by being given the vote. And by being given the vote, thus negating their marginalized status within the political realm as women living under patriarchy, they re-embraced the status quo and maintained their class position as non-workers living under capitalism. By successfully campaigning and having suffrage extended to them, these upper-class women, these owning class women, were inducted into civil society to be on par with their equally upper-class husbands and male relatives. They could now inhabit a realm once held exclusively by men. The upper class, the owning class, became elastic enough to extend its population in order to most effectively conserve the overall class structure and especially the owning class's power as those that govern the direction of society, then as now. So these mostly upper-class women, using the fight for suffrage and mobilising industrial action to demonstrate the might of women, used forms of gendered class antagonism to induce a realignment of their own class for their own exclusive political interests, with no regard, of course, for the women who did not fall into this class. This analysis can be deepened in paraphrasal of Kolontais's examination of the woman question. The aspiration of bourgeois women does not and cannot correspond with the needs of working-class women. These needs do not prevent working-class women from requiring a bettering of their status within the world as it exists now, but requires them realising these desires being realised is inherently hindered by capitalism's nature. Feminists, in our case, as demonstrated by suffragettes and those speaking on behalf of rather than alongside working women, are either unwilling or incapable of understanding this because they are comfortable with the capacity of the law to secure their equality. Therefore, each new concession won by bourgeois women is crafted into a weapon of exploitation to be used against working class women because of the ever-escalating economic gap between the two social camps of women. It was Kolontais's view, and humbly continued in mine, that the pursuit of material comfort and dignified living, of bread and roses, cannot be achieved through the positioning of women's plight as universal, and therefore, in this view, as an impetus for collaboration between classes of diametrically opposed interest. Rather, by accepting the particular burden of hyper-exploitation that capitalism, in its imperial stage, places upon women all over the world, but in the modern era, especially the global south, is revealed the only effective strategy for combating this exploitation. i.e. that bread for all and roses too may only be achieved through the uniting of shared interests amongst those that have only their labour to sell and are thus exploited for it in antagonism against the demands of capital, even and especially when those espousing the demands of capital have female faces. This is historically best achieved through genuinely radical instances of industrial action under the guidance of a vanguard of workers and the strategic withholding of labour for power to dictate the society being put into the workers' hands. In essence, establishing a society run by the workers for the workers. And what better way to keep up spirits in pursuit of that goal than to sing? So, yeah. Join a fucking union.